Hey everyone, you're listening to the Her Head in Films podcast. I'm your host. My name is Caitlin. If you're new to the podcast and you don't know who I am, as I said, my name is Caitlin. I'm a writer. I'm a dreamer. I love literature. I love art. And I also have a really intense, passionate love for cinema. I live in a rural area in the South in the United States. And so I created this podcast because I don't really have anyone to talk to about cinema or films that I watch. And so I needed an outlet to get all my feelings out. And that's what this podcast is. It's about my personal musings, my personal emotions and feelings about the various films that I watch. I tend to watch mainly art house, international, world cinema. And so those are the films that I am most passionate about. If you're a returning listener, I appreciate you and thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I have something to announce. I started a Patreon page for this podcast to make it sustainable, and that's spelled Patreon. Patreon.com. It's where people who are making podcasts or who are writing or who are making videos, they can create an account, and your fans and your followers and all the people that listen to you and love what you do, they can support you each month monetarily. And so I did that, and I have all kinds of rewards available at different tiers. For just $1 a month, you get access to special content, including the Her Head in Films Extra podcast, which is like mini podcasts where I talk about different films, and it's shorter. It's like 15 to 20 minutes. So if you just can't get enough of me talking about films, you can unlock that. And I'm going to be doing posts with reviews and recommendations and all kinds of other goodies that you can get access to. And then I have another level where you can vote on things that I talk about on the podcast. I have another level where you can recommend a film to me and I'll review it on the podcast. And I also have a level where you get a shout out in the podcast. And so I want to give a shout out to Carolyn and Michelle. I just want to thank both of you for supporting the podcast and helping to sustain it. I really appreciate you, and you're wonderful. So if any of you are listening and that interests you, you go to patreon.com/herheadinfilms. I'll also have the link in the description, and it's just a way to make the podcast sustainable, but to also to make you feel part of it if you want to be part of it, and if you enjoy what I do. And yeah, I really appreciate all of you. Thank you to Carolyn and Michelle for supporting. You're wonderful. So today's podcast is about the 1995 film La Cérémonie by Claude Chabrol, and I'm going to talk about that today. It's a really great thriller about class, and I can't wait to dig into it. But first, returning listeners will know that sometimes at the beginning of the podcast I just like to talk about general things. And so yesterday we've been having some bad weather. There was a tropical storm that hit one of the states near us, and so we've been getting a lot of rain and bad weather. Today we were under tornado watches, which was really scary for me. I really struggle with that. But last night we had a power outage, and we lost all our power, and it was dark, and it was, you don't realize how dependent you are on electricity until you don't have it anymore. And it's a strange darkness when you have a power outage, because there was no street lights, there was no light whatsoever. It's like this total smothering, suffocating darkness that happens, and it was scary to me. I get scared with things like that. It just felt like the void, and like nothingness, and it's a scary thing to confront, I think, when all the things that you rely on are taken away. And so it only lasted for like an hour. So I'm sounding too dramatic, I know. But every time we get that kind of a power outage or something, it just completely destabilizes me. But then this morning I woke up and I went on Twitter, and it's Abbas Kiarostami's birthday. And Criterion Collection on Twitter posted this quote by him, and I just really loved it. And it seemed to really connect to sort of the darkness of last night and the fear. But he once said, "In the total darkness, poetry is still there, and it is there for you." And so I would sort of argue that what I love about cinema, and even though I don't go to a movie theater as much as I used to because I don't have a really great theater near me, it mainly plays the blockbusters and the commercial films that I'm not interested in. But when I did go to the movie theater, what was great is that you're sitting in darkness, but cinema is light. Cinema is the light in that darkness. And I know it sounds cliche. As you know, it sounded good in my head, and then I'm saying it, and it doesn't sound quite as smart. But I love that in the total darkness, poetry is still there, and it is there for you. And I love poetry, I love literature, I love art, I love cinema. Those are the things that I live for and that make life worth living, along with my mom, of course, and love and, certain connections and relationships that I have. But without those things, there is a complete darkness, and I think what's gotten me through a lot of the really difficult experiences in my life, and the ones that I continue to go through, is what is the light in the darkness for you? For some people it might be a book, or it might be a person, or for me it's often been cinema, and it's often been films. And so I really love that I have this outlet to talk about films and to talk about why they matter to me, and hopefully maybe I can be somebody else's light in the darkness. And maybe when someone hears my voice or listens to my podcast, maybe it helps them in that moment, or maybe it makes them feel a little bit less alone in the world. And that's really all I can try to do. And that's why I started the podcast, and that's why I continue to do it, besides my own selfish reason of just, needing a way to express my feelings and emotions. This podcast is very raw, it's very personal, and that's never going to change. Like, that's who I am, and that's what I think is missing from the discourse around film, is that I think online especially, but also in academia or whatever, I think film can be really saturated with theory and with really big $5 words and really big concepts. And I'm not against that, I'm not. But I don't really want to talk about those things. I want to talk about how I connect to a film, what I think's important in it. I want to go on the level of the subjective and the personal and the sort of what hits you in the heart, what hits you in the gut about a film. So Kiarostami for me is definitely a light in the dark too, and I really love his work, and we lost him way too soon. I can't believe it's almost been a year. On July 4th, July 4th, 2017, it will have been a year. So let's get to the main event, which is La Cérémonie, like I said, by Claude Chabrol, came out in 1995. A thriller that's really about class, and that's what I love about it. So a little bit of background information about Claude Chabrol. He was a very prolific director. He was born in 1930, he died in 2010, and from the time he started making films, he made about a film each year. He started as a writer for Cahiers du Cinéma, so he was part of the French New Wave, so he was part of the group of François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Rohmer, and he started on Cahiers du Cinéma and then started to direct his own films, and was a very integral part of the French New Wave in the 1960s. He did a lot of thrillers. I don't know how many he did, but he did quite a few. La Cérémonie is considered a late masterpiece It came out in 1995, and as I said, he died in 2010, so it was one of his, later films in the last 15 years of his life. The premise of La Cérémonie is that a maid, played by Sandrine Bonnaire, goes to live and work for a rich, upper-class French family in the countryside. She meets another woman, a postal clerk in the community, in the town, and the two of them start a very intense and interesting relationship. And before I go any further, I do have to say there will be spoilers. I want to be able to talk fully about this film, and I don't want to have to censor myself or think, oh, am I spoiling it? So if you haven't seen the film, maybe wait, see it, come back to the podcast. If you have seen it, great. If you don't mind it being spoiled, then go ahead and keep listening. So the postal clerk is played by Isabelle Huppert, and so the two women create this bond. They're both pariahs, they're both outsiders, and their bond ultimately leads to murder. It's a deadly bond. So Sandrine Bonnaire is I think, a well-known French actress. She's certainly one of my favorites, and I really do adore her. I first saw her in a French film called À nos amours, and that was when she was really young. She was like a teenager. And but she actually has a history of playing very working class characters, as she does in La Cérémonie. She plays Sophie. That is her character. She was in an Agnes Varda film called Vagabond that was really successful, and I think did very well for Varda. In that film, she played a drifter, a homeless girl who is found dead due to exposure, due to being out in the cold. And the film goes back through her last few weeks and months in her life. And it's a very, I think, sympathetic portrait about someone living on the margins of society, which I always think Varda is really good at. Like, she did something similar with The Gleaners and I love Agnes Varda. Bonnaire also did a recent film called Queen to Play in 2009 with Kevin Kline, where she played a cleaning lady who falls in love with the game of chess, but it's very much a film about working class life and working class struggle, and I actually did a mini episode about it for the Patreon page, so it's for patrons only. But yeah, I really loved that film. Isabelle Huppert had worked with Claude Chabrol previously before she did La Cérémonie. She was in Violette, and she was in Story of Women. Story of Women is a really, really good film where she played an abortion provider at a time when abortion was still illegal in France, I think. So it's a really good film. So she definitely had a history with Claude Chabrol. So Sandrine Bonnaire plays Sophie, Isabelle Huppert plays Jeanne, and I'm going to use those names when I talk about the film. So Sophie goes to work for this upper-class family. They're called the Lelev family. It's like this nuclear bourgeois family. You have the mother, the father, daughter, and son, and they're like teenagers. They live in a very spacious mansion, in the town, and they certainly have status and standing and resources, and so she goes to work for them, Sophie does, played by Sandrine Bonnaire. But she has a really big secret. She has something that she's hiding, and it's a really crucial part of the film, and that is that she is illiterate. She is perhaps dyslexic. It's not completely clear what her learning disability is, but she is completely illiterate, and every move that she makes and everything she does is an attempt to conceal that fact from this family and to conceal it from other people around her. Sophie is someone who, you can tell for much of her life, she has felt marginalized, she's felt invisible, she's felt very much outside of I guess like normal life in a way because of her illiteracy. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the Cérémonie is actually based on a Ruth Rendell book called Judgment in Stone. And a lot of French directors have actually adapted Ruth Rendell's work. It's just very popular among the French. But I have Judgment in Stone, and I definitely want to read it, but I didn't want to read it before doing this review. So Sophie has this disability. I guess you could call it a disability, and it's interesting because she's working for a family who is exceptionally literate. They love to listen to opera music. They are very cultured. They are very, sort of your stereotypical or your just normal bourgeois upper class family, and she doesn't come from that world. She comes from a working class world. Obviously, she comes from an impoverished background in which perhaps she was not able to, she didn't get the education that she needed, or she didn't get the help that she needed to learn how to read. And so, as I said, every movement she makes, she tells them that her vision is bad. She doesn't even drive because obviously she can't read the signs. So they have to drive her places, but she covers that up by saying, oh, I have vision problems. She goes so far as to buy these like pink tinted glasses and to pretend like those are her vision glasses when they're obviously not. And so when she needs to read something, or if somebody hands her a piece of paper that she needs to read, she'll say, oh, I don't have my glasses with me, so I can't read it. Can you read it to me? And there's this scene where I think the mother of the family leaves like a list of things that she wants Sophie to do, and Sophie can't read the paper. She doesn't know what it says, so she goes and she gets someone else to read it for her. So she has figured out how to navigate her disability while also feeling a great deal of, I think, shame about it, because she does not want anyone to know. I don't think she wants to be pitied. I mean, maybe that's part of it. And obviously her illiteracy is probably the reason why she is a maid in the first place, because obviously other professions are closed to her. She's not able to perform certain jobs. So it's easier to be a maid where you're, making a bed, or you're cleaning toilets, or you're cooking. Those are things that you can conceivably do without having to be very literate. So you see how her illiteracy has put her in a particular situation in life, and the shame she has about it, and the lengths that she goes to conceal it as much as possible. So she's this very isolated person. She goes and she lives with the family, and they give her like a room up on the top floor, and they give her a television that she can watch. She watches a lot of TV. She doesn't talk a lot. She's not very gregarious. She's not very outgoing. She seems to me like someone her whole life who has tried to be as invisible as possible, who has tried to shrink herself and not and just sort of fade. It's almost like she's not there in many ways. And that's why I found the character to be really important to me, because I'm interested in women like that. I'm interested in women who are on the margins, who are not able to fit into the mainstream or the status quo, who struggle in some way. And I think Sophie is that character. And I saw this film a few years ago. I watched it because I was interested in it. I may have been going through my Isabel Huppert period, where I was watching all her films because I love Isabel. I love that she's getting more attention now, more than ever, because she really is a treasure, I think. And I liked the film. I really did, but it was only when I rewatched it recently on Filmstruck that it really hit me, that I realized the nuances and the subtleties of the film and how much it was about class. But it's also about disability, isn't it? It's also about this woman who is doing everything she can she's carrying like this secret that she's terrified of anybody finding out about. And when her secret is revealed, that is the catalyst for the violence that comes later on in the film. So it's this very important part, and it explains her. She's just very lonely. She's very alone. She's very isolated. I don't think maybe she wants to let people in. And Sandrine Bonnaire plays the character so well. Like, even the way she walks, or the look in her eyes, or there's just something vacant about her. There's something absent in a way. Because she doesn't fit in, and she is this outsider. And also, when you're a maid, obviously, and this goes back to the class issue, you have to behave in a particular way, in a subservient way. You have to be quiet. You have to be submissive. So her profession and her status and her class also forces her to disappear herself in a way, to erase parts of herself, because she can't talk back to the lady of the house. She can't have an attitude. She has to constantly, do whatever they want her to do. She has to be pliable. She has to be pleasant and make sure that she's not seen. She eats separately from the family because that's just how things are done. So she is always in this film someone on the margin, someone who is excluded, someone who is there but not there. I mean, that's really part of being a maid, or being a person in a service sort of capacity or a service position, is that you're there but you're not there. You're there in so much as you do what you're told to do, but you are not really a full person to these people. They just see you as the hired help. They just see you as you're just someone who's just sort of there. And I think that's what Chabrol in this film is so brilliant at showing, is that I think a lot of people would look, and I read a review that sort of acted like the family was completely blameless, that the family was just, this really nice, innocent family. That may be true to an extent. They were not beating Sophie. They were not, incredibly violent with her or incredibly cruel. But what I loved about the film was it really showed the subtleties of class, of the way that people with money treat people without it. And I'll give you an example. Sophie is supposed to have Sundays off. And she asks specifically and tells the woman of the house, the wife, who's played by Jacqueline Bisset, she tells her that she's going to go off one Sunday and that she has things that she needs to do. Well, I think there's like a party or something, or somebody's coming to visit. And she had already talked to Jacqueline Bisset's character about leaving early. And so the day comes, Sophie does her work, she prepares the food, she sets everything up, and then she leaves, just like she told them she was going to. Well, Jacqueline Bisset just gets beside herself. She's like, well, where did Sophie go? Where did Sophie go? I mean, it's Sunday, it's her one day off probably. And she just gets so upset about it when Sophie had already talked to her about having the day off. She almost sees Sophie as this possession, and her kids actually call her out on it, or they call their parents out on it, of, why do you always treat her like a possession, like she belongs to you or something? And it is this subtle thing that is done. But the kids themselves are guilty of it too. They have this sort of bred into them in a way, or it's something that they have learned throughout their life. There's a scene where Sophie and the daughter are sitting at a table, and I don't know, I noticed this, I don't know if anybody else would, but but they're sitting there. I think she's looking at a magazine. I could be wrong. And I think she wants something. The daughter wants something, or something to eat, or something to drink. And she just expects Sophie to do it. Like, she doesn't ask Sophie, will you get me this thing? Will you get me something to drink or something to eat? They're just sitting there, and she just expects Sophie to do it. She just expects Sophie to wait on her. So even though the kids are sort of aware of the class issues and aware of how their parents might treat Sophie, they are not quite as conscious of how they treat Sophie. So there are many examples in the film, but they're very subtle. And I think only if you're, I don't want to, make a blanket statement here, but I think if you're someone like me who is from a very working class, poor background, because that's how I grew up. My mom and dad did minimum wage jobs. My dad worked, he loaded trucks. He worked at a place where he, like, if you see 18-wheeler trucks and stuff, my dad would do like a hand cart or a forklift, and he would load those trucks, and that was his job. My mom worked in a factory. If you ever go to see, she worked in daycares. If you ever have seen like furniture, upholstery samples of fabric, well, there's somebody that has to put those samples of fabric on a card, and that's what she used to do. So my parents have always worked in factories or worked in warehouses at like minimum wage or maybe a little bit above. I've had minimum wage jobs. I've had a lot of temporary jobs, like not a lot of upward economic mobility. Constantly struggling, going without health care. I haven't seen a dentist in probably 20 years. I haven't had health insurance for most of my life. I don't get to go to the doctor. I don't get to have regular screenings. I don't, if something is wrong with me, I would have to go to the ER probably, and I don't even know if they would help me, So there's always this sense of you're living this very precarious existence, that you don't have access to the same resources that other people have, and you know consciously that you're probably not going to live as long as other people with more money. I mean, that is the reality when you live in this country, and when you live in a lot of places that do not have universal health care, that does not have a social safety net. You know that you're probably not going to live as long as other people, because you haven't had access to health care since you were born. You don't have access to resources and things that you need. That's just the reality. So, and I also know what it's like to be in these interactions with people where they know that you're lower class, they know that you're poor or working class, and they're not. I've been around wealthy people. I've been around people with money. And there's a subtle thing there that you can't quite explain to people, of how you are treated by people with money. And they may not mean to, they may not be conscious of it, but they act a certain way. And so when I was watching the movie, I was like very aware of how Sophie was treated by the family, and the ways in which her autonomy and her freedom and her independence were circumscribed, is what I would say. So Sophie is this very isolated and lonely person until she meets Isabelle Hupert's character, who's named Jeanne. Jeanne works at the post office, and the two of them end up meeting. They end up connecting. I think the family goes on vacation for a little while, and her and Jeanne end up connecting and becoming really fast friends. Jeanne has a lot of animosity towards the family. She vocalizes the class issues much more. She resents their wealth. She resents their status. and all the money that they have, she feels that they don't treat other people right, that they have this attitude and that they look down on people. So Sophie and Jeanne become fast friends, and they also share an experience with death and violence. Sophie may have been involved in the death of her father. It's not quite clear. It looks like she may have been her father died like under suspicious circumstances, I think in a fire or something. I can't be quite sure, so don't quote me on it. But there was suspicion that Sophie might have been involved in it. Jeanne was investigated for the death of her daughter, and sort of, I think at the end, basically sort of confesses to killing her daughter, perhaps accidentally, perhaps on purpose. So both of them are already sort of criminal in a way. They have already perhaps committed criminal acts that have further marginalized them from society, because they are deviant. Both of them are deviant. And they sort of, when they come together, they become very different than they were when they were separated. Although Jeanne is she's much more gregarious. She's much more outgoing. She's much more, I think, influential and manipulative and devious. And Sophie, with her sort of submissiveness and her placidity, comes under the spell of Jeanne, I would say. She starts to do her hair like Jeanne. Jeanne does braided pigtails, and after her and Jeanne become really good friends, Sophie starts to wear her hair in braided pigtails. They watch TV together. They connect through the violence that they both may have committed. And they also connect through class, as I said. They're both working class women. Jeanne works at the post office. Sophie is a maid. And they both pick up on the subtle ways that the rich people treat poor people. There's a really good example of this with Jeanne. And once again, I don't know if people watching it will pick up on it the way that I do. But it's something that I definitely did notice when I was watching it. There's this scene where I think the daughter, her car breaks down, and Jeanne offers to help her. Or wait, is it the reverse? It might be that Jeanne has broken down, that her car has broken down, and the daughter offers to help her. Yeah, I think that's more of the dynamic there. And so the daughter she goes and she looks under the hood and she does something, and then the car starts up again, because Jeanne's car is very old, of course, because she doesn't have a lot of money. And the daughter, her hands are dirty, and she goes to Jeanne's window, and Jeanne gives her like a handkerchief to wipe her hands. And then after the daughter is done wiping her hands, she throws the handkerchief at Jeanne. Like, just throws it in her face. It's like this moment where I was like, oh my god. Like, I don't know if other people would have picked up on it. I don't know if it was just me, but I was like, she just threw a dirty piece of cloth at this woman. Like, I thought it was so rude. I just thought it, but the daughter does it in such like a cavalier, thoughtless, nonchalant way, and I think it's indicative of the way in which this family acts towards everybody that they see as below them. That they just act in this very nonchalant way. They just expect Sophie to do everything. They just, I don't think they're blameless, is what I'm saying. I think that because of the culture that they live in, that values the rich and gives the rich ridiculous power over other people, that they have learned a certain way to act, and it's very thoughtless and it's very harmful, I think. And you can see that tension, that class tension, and that class conflict. Yeah. It's subtle, but it's there. And I don't know if everybody picks up on it the way I did, but I'd like to talk more about the friendship between Sophie and Jeanne. They share that working class aspect. They share that sort of criminal deviance. They really are in many ways unruly women. I'm reading this book by Anne Helen Peterson, and it's called Too Fat, Too Slutty, Too Loud. And she writes a lot about unruly women, women who transgress boundaries, women who overflow boundaries, really, and are sort of excessive and subversive, and they don't fit into these little categories that we expect of women. And I would say that Jeanne and Sophie are definitely unruly women. Their friendship is born out of a shared class struggle, a shared class position, a shared history of hurting people for whatever reason that they want to hurt people. And it's all the more shocking because they're women, and it's not seen as acceptable for women to act in a way that is violent. And I'm not condoning the violence of this film, but I'm saying that it comes from a place that it doesn't come out of a vacuum, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sophie and Jeanne are very much troublemakers. When they get together, they just start to luxuriate in making trouble and being deviant and subversive. And like, there's this really great scene near the end of the film where Jeanne is the ringmaster here. I mean, she propels the film. I think she is the propulsive force of this film. I think if Sophie had never met Jeanne, then everything would have gone just fine, and she would have just kept living her very sort of empty, isolated, lonely life in a way, because she's there and she's not there, and she is basically invisible to the world. But when she ends up with Jeanne, it's like fireworks. They become really close friends. Like, there's this amazing scene where they're sitting in Sophie's room, and they have their arms around each other, and their hair is both braided in pigtails, and they're sitting on the floor watching TV, and it's like they almost look like twins in a way. It's like they become one another. Almost reminds me a bit of Persona, a bit, by Ingmar Bergman. That great scene where Liv Ullmann and B.B. Anderson, like, their faces merge. These women are almost like mirror reflections of each other, and they become that. And it reminds me of like a lot of books that I've read and a lot of films that I've watched about women who murder, women who commit violence together. How when two women come together, I'm specifically thinking of Heavenly Creatures, that film, about two young girls who murder one of the young girls' mother, the mother of one of the young girls. It's like, separately, they probably would have just gone on and had ordinary lives, but together, the emotions and the I don't even know how to put it into words, but like, I remember when I had a really close female friend when I was very young, and how when we were together, it was just, everything was heightened, everything was magnified, and we almost lived in our own little world the way they did in Heavenly Creatures. And it's almost like Sophie and Jeanne create this world for themselves, or they start to exist in the real world in a way in which they do not believe in rules or boundaries. So they're going around, they're getting donations for the church, and Jeanne goes into this old lady's house, and the woman is giving her the donations, and Jeanne's like just plops on the floor and is going through the bag of donations and it's like, nope, not this. Why are you giving this to the poor? Why are you giving this junk to people? And the woman is horrified. She's like, what are you doing? But I actually thought this was a sort of defiant moment in terms of the class conflict, is because I've gone through really difficult periods of my life. And one time, this was right after my father died, probably, I don't know how long it was after my father died. He passed away in 2006, and it plunged my mother and I into poverty. And we were really struggling and to make ends meet and buy groceries and just survive. And I remember that we had gone to, or no, they came to us. Yeah, like, oh God, it was like Christmas. And these people just show up at our door with like this box of food we had not even asked for. I think it was a family member or something that had told, I guess, a church or something about us. And they just show up and they just are there with this box of food, and like we have our Christmas tree up, and the woman comes in and she's like almost shocked, I guess, that we have a Christmas tree or that we decorated for Christmas. I guess we weren't properly poor enough or something. Like, you have to almost perform in a particular way when you are poor and not have anything ever. And just, I still remember the shame of the moment, like, of these people with this box of food, and none of the food went together. I mean, it's like, it's a can of corn, there's no meat, there's no way to make a meal out of it, it's just the most random food that, like, nobody, if you got to go to a grocery store and pick out food, you would not necessarily pick out these things. Or just a few years ago, we were really in a bad place. I had lost my job. My mom's husband had lost his job. And we had to go to a food bank. We had to go to this church to get food. And the things they gave us, like, the bread was hard as a rock. There was expired food. There was things that weren't even labeled. Like, it was just meat in a package. And, you know, when you go to the grocery store, there'll be, like, labels on it, you know, to tell you what it is. It was just meat, I guess, in cellophane. There was a jar of pickles, I think, and it didn't even have a label on it. It could have just come from someone's house. It was the most random food. They gave us, like, these pastries that were, like, inedible. You know, they were just too old. Like, you couldn't actually eat them. They didn't give us good meat. They didn't give us things where you could make a meal out of it. They didn't give us things that we could actually survive on. You know, like, we ate a few of the things that we got, and then we had to throw the rest of it out. And it made me feel like dirt. And it made me feel so worthless. Like, I wasn't even worth, you know, feeding, right? So, and I still feel the shame of it. And so when Jeanne is going through these donations and saying, well, why would you give this junk to anybody? Nobody wants this. She's saying, why would you give poor people something that you wouldn't even want? Aren't the poor deserving of something better than that? Why are you just giving scraps to people? Why are you giving things that you don't even want and that you don't even think is good, and you're just giving it to the poor like they don't even matter, like they don't even deserve decent clothes, you know, or decent items? And so I actually saw that scene as sort of kind of exhilarating in a way. I was like, yeah, go Jeanne, you know, because people just, and it's the same thing with food. I'm making an analogy here, you know, that the food that people donate is like, some of it is not even edible anymore, or it has an unknown source. If you wouldn't eat it, if you why would you give it to poor people? But that's what we do, that's what happens to poor people. So I actually saw that moment as sort of really interesting, of her saying, well, fuck this. This is terrible stuff. Why are you donating this to the poor? And I thought it was kind of funny. And I have to admit, I found something just really interesting about these women. And I know that I think we're probably supposed to be repulsed by them or horrified by them. But because of the element of class in the film, they're actually, I think, saying something through their actions. Their violence, at least against this family, is out of sort of a shared sense of being wounded, a shared sense of being treated less than, and wanting to fight back against that in some way. These are women who are very much on the outside of society. They are not acceptable women, especially Jeanne. I mean, even the townspeople, I think she killed her daughter in another town, and then she was moved there, I guess to escape the stigma and the controversy about her killing her daughter. And, but it taints her. It still taints her. And so she is very much a pariah, even more than Sophie is. And she is someone who has crossed a particular boundary, through murder, through killing her daughter. She is someone who is not really bound by the dictates or the rules of society. She is excessively unruly and excessively deviant, in the eyes of other people. This film, the relationship between Sophie and Jeanne, reminded me, and I think the film was inspired by this too, of the Papin sisters. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Papin sisters. There's been quite a few adaptations of their story made. They were maids in France, and they killed the wife and daughter of their employer in 1933. Their names were Christine and Leah, and there was rumors that they had a sexual relationship. There's been a film called Murderous Maids that has Sylvie Testud in it. That was made in 2000, I think. I haven't seen it. There's another film called Sister, My Sister with Jolie Richardson. I have seen that one. It was very interesting. Jean Genet wrote the play The Maids about the Papin sisters. And so there's this... They are this huge obsession, I think, for a lot of French writers and French intellectuals, because a lot of people felt that their actions were motivated by their treatment as maids, their treatment as a lower class, and they were striking out against their employers because they worked very long hours. They might have got a day or a half day off on Sundays. I think they gouged the eyes out of their victims too. So La Cérémonie is, I think, in part, perhaps, inspired by that, and perhaps Chabrol took Judgment in Stone by Ruth Rendell and then merged it with the story of the Papin sisters. So, I mean, if you've seen the film and you're interested about this relationship between Sophie and Jeanne, then you might want to check out those films or learn more about the Papin sisters. That's Papin. They have always fascinated me, and I've I think there was this biography or this book about them, but it's so expensive. I've always wanted to read it because they definitely interest me. This is a theme in my life of murderous, violent women. I don't know why. It's just, I think when you have these really high profile cases of women killers, whether it's the Women of Heavenly Creatures, which one's Anne Perry. Anne Perry was one of the girls. She's actually a crime writer and a mystery writer now. But when she was a teenager, she helped kill her best friend's mother. But she was released once she became an adult. And I can't remember the other girl's name. But, or like recently I was watching some documentaries about Eileen Wuornos, who was a female serial killer here in the United States. It just feels like to me when we have these really high profile cases of women killers is that you really see gender expectations and gender norms play out, and you see the way women are covered by the press and the media, the way they're talked about, the way they're written about, and you see how frightening it is for people to see women who commit violence, because women are supposed to be nurturing and pleasant, and women are not supposed to get angry. Women are not supposed to feel rage. We are sanctioned if we do that. We are seen as bitches and all kinds of negative things when we have unruly, uncontrollable emotions. But what's even more interesting for me about female serial killers is how their crimes often come out of the consequences of sexism and gender expectations. For example, with Eileen Wuornos, her murders come out of her being raped by one of her Johns. The first one was a man named Mallory. His last name was Mallory. And people theorize that this is why she started to kill men, is because she was a prostitute, and she was, with this man, and he raped her and violated her and was very violent with her, and she lost it. She fought back. And what's interesting about this Mallory man is that previously he had spent 10 years in prison for rape. So it gives credence to what she says happened. And Wuornos is someone who came from poverty, who was sexually abused and violated from a very young age, who had a child when she was 13 that she had to give up, and was thrown out of the house while in Michigan in the winter time, sleeping outside, sleeping in cars, sleeping in the snow, sleeping in woods. This is someone from the time she was born. She was abandoned, she was used, she was abused, she was treated like she was nothing. So society damages and destroys her. Men use her and rape her and violate her. And so that's where I think those murders come from. When you hear about women killers, they rarely say, oh yeah, I just loved it, I just enjoyed it. It may come from an abusive relationship. It may come from all kinds of different sources. For the Papin sisters, it may have been connected to class, that they were treated so terribly by their employers. I'm not saying every instance of a woman killing is justified, or that it's, that she did nothing wrong, or it's always somebody else, or there are absolutely women that commit horrific violence, and I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying that in some instances, women are... Okay, stop. That sometimes that violence has a root, and the root is connected to society, the root is connected to sexism, the root is connected to classism, or to racism, or to other forms of violence that are uniquely perpetrated against women sometimes. So, and I think with La Cérémonie, that violence, the violence of the ending where Jean and Sophie kill the family, it like I said, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was this accumulation, this buildup of animosity, of tension, of feeling like they were treated less than. although there's an aspect of the crime and of the murder that sort of subverts that reading, in that there is a pleasure that these women take in killing, and perhaps that's a projection of people's fears about women killers, is that they get off on it and they love it. And I think of Carla Faye Tucker, and she was another, I don't know if she was a serial killer, but she was a murderer, and that women can get pleasure out of violence, and how people are not prepared to see that. Like, we see it all the time with men. We see men who just love violence. They just love it. We see it in movies. We see it, we see men doing violence. But when women do it, we're very uncomfortable with it. And it's very disturbing at the end. Like I said, I'm not condoning the violence. I myself am like a pacifist, and I hate violence. I don't believe it is acceptable. I don't condone any kind of violence, really, unless it is self-defense, unless you have no choice, and you have to do it. But with the Cérémonie, the ending, there is a sense of pleasure, especially with Jeanne. Jeanne loves it. While the family is listening to this opera down in the living room, Sophie and Jeanne are almost anarchic. It's anarchy. It is the liberation of any kind of, what do I want to say? Anything that was holding them back, from violence, or they just completely let it go. They are completely out of control, and at the same time completely exhilarated and euphoric and ecstatic about going into the family's bedroom and tearing up their clothes and pouring hot chocolate all over the bedding. And it's just, they just love destroying the house before they destroy the bodies of the family. They are getting off on it in a way. Even Sophie enjoys it. She's laughing. There's no fear. There's no remorse. There's no anything. It's a sense of pleasure. It's a sense of excitement. It's a sense of, oh, this is fun. It's like this joyful thing that they're doing, and they're murdering people. And so in a way, it's also maybe Chabrol is commenting on violence, and I don't want to make this connection, but I think it's very interesting that the TV is so prominent in this film. Sophie's always watching TV, and Jeanne watches it with her. And I wonder if Chabrol is maybe trying to say something about how television desensitizes us. Not that Sophie is watching violent things on the TV, but it's just maybe something to think about. How do people commit these acts of violence and feel nothing? Maybe it's a look at violence itself and a commentary on violence itself. Like, I just finished a book called Human Acts by Han Kang, and it's about a real-life event that happened in 1980 in South Korea, which was the massacre of hundreds of students who were protesting the government, and they were murdered. They were murdered by soldiers and by the government, and her book is about that act of violence. It was also some of the kids, some of the students and the people were rounded up, they were taken to prison, they were tortured. So it's a book that is deeply concerned with violence and with the way in which human acts of violence affect human beings and human bodies. It's about death, it's about grief, it's about trauma to the body, trauma to the mind. And I came away with a bigger question about violence itself, about how do you take a gun and murder someone, or take a bayonet, or take a knife? How do you torture somebody? How do you enact violence on another body? How do you rape someone? How do you do these things to another human being? And I watch a lot of crime shows. I'm going to be honest here. I watch Forensic Files constantly. Every day I'm watching Forensic Files. I've seen every episode multiple times. I watch Dateline. I watch 48 Hours. I watch The New Detectives, which is on Netflix, and it's like an older show from the 90s. I only watch true crime, though. I don't watch things like CSI or Criminal Minds. I don't watch things that dramatize or fictionalize it. I watch the true stuff, the documentaries. And I think that maybe that's why I keep doing it, is because I want to know how does another person commit violence against another person? Because I'm someone who's deeply sensitive and deeply I don't want to physically hurt anyone. And I'm someone who's afraid of violence. I've never had it committed against me the way some people have. And I don't know how I would handle it. And I just think that is the constant thing that I ask is how do you do this? And the ending of La Cérémonie is graphic. It's difficult to watch. No matter what you feel about this family and about the class dynamics within the house and the subtle ways in which Sophie is treated as property and treated as less than, no matter any of that, when you see Jean and Sophie take a shotgun and murder these people, you are sickened. I mean, you're shocked. You're seeing these people lay there bleeding, and they're laughing, and they're loving it, and then there's this huge twist at the end where they've been watching the opera, but the daughter or the son set up the boombox to record the opera off the TV. And that boombox records the entire murder, and it captures the gunshots and the moaning, and then of course Jean and Sophie talking to each other, and taking joy in it, and loving what they've done, and you see these two women and you don't understand them, and they remain throughout the film very enigmatic, very unknowable and mysterious in a way, because you know that they've had prior incidents with violence, but you're not quite sure why they're doing what they're doing. It could be tied to class, could be tied to a lot of different things, but you never, and I think even now when it comes to killers or crime shows or whatever, I think that is the question for a lot of people, is why. People want this motive. They want to know why. They always want to know why somebody murdered another person. And I wonder, do we ever really know why? Do we ever really know the motive? And also, do we ever understand the how of how do you cross that line? How do you go from being someone who is law-abiding, who has not taken a human life, to crossing into the person that takes another human life? What has to happen for you to get to that point? And I think with Jean and Sophie, Chabrol obviously gives us no answers, no easy answers. These are women who remain unknowable. I mean, Sophie is inscrutable always, even at the end. And I thought it was so interesting, Sandrine Bonnaire. I wonder who chose her haircut, because the bangs that she wears, and if you see the film, you know, I almost thought it was a master stroke, to do her hair that way, because the bangs are very, very short, and there's something very blunt about them and very strange about them, and they're jagged, and it just seemed to perfectly go with the character. And Sandrine's face is very almost hollow. She looks like she's maybe lost some weight, and her cheeks are sort of sunken, and she just has this whole appearance of someone who just doesn't fit, and doesn't, I don't even know what to say. It's so hard, but it's just, Sandrine played that character perfectly. And of course Isabelle Huppert, was amazing as Jeanne. But even at the end, you see her face, and after everything, after Jeanne's driven off and died, Jeanne gets in a car wreck and dies at the end, and they find the recording, and Sophie is just walking down the road. You don't know if they're going to capture her, if they're not, where she's going to go, what she's going to do. I mean, she's probably going to get captured. She's probably going to go to prison. And for what? Why did she participate in this act of violence? Obviously, maybe the point is that she felt nothing. Maybe both of them were people who just felt nothing. Killing a person is the same as eating breakfast. There is no differentiation. There is a nothingness to them in a way, sort of an emptiness, a vacancy. I think Sandrine really brought that through with Sophie. It's when you look at Sandrine's eyes, there's just this vacancy there. There's nothing behind it. There's no soul, almost. And of course, what were the conditions to create that in her? The illiteracy, perhaps the poverty, the loneliness, the marginalization, the invisibility, the being treated less than by people, working for people that wanted her to be subservient and small and disappear and not be there unless they had a need that they needed met. So there's all these things that I think for Sophie have numbed her in a way, and perhaps deadened her emotions or her feelings, and maybe killing the family is her way of, I don't know, of getting retribution, of a reckoning of some kind, and like I said, the catalyst of it is, God, I totally forgot to mention this, that the daughter finds out that Sophie is illiterate, that Sophie can't read, and the daughter just handles it pretty well. She's like, well, we can get you reading lessons, we can do that. But then again, it's such a patronizing, sort of condescending thing. Oh, well, we'll get you lessons, we'll help you. That's the one thing that Sophie doesn't want. She doesn't want pity. She doesn't want to be condescended to. She doesn't want to be treated, differently. And she certainly didn't want anybody to know that she was illiterate. And so that really seems to be the catalyst for all this, because she threatens the daughter. The daughter's like, oh, well, it'll be okay. And she says, if you tell anyone, I have dirt on you. The daughter's pregnant. She hasn't told the family. She's like, well, I think she calls her a bitch, perhaps. And she's like, I'll tell the family that you're pregnant. So she becomes very upset and almost violent in terms of her language and her words, that she's blackmailing the daughter, and she feels exposed. I think maybe all that shame and all that, everything that she has felt related to her disability or her illiteracy comes up, and perhaps she's worried that the family would tell the next people that she wanted to work for. So it all sort of bubbles over in that moment of her secret being found out, because her entire life is about guarding that secret and making sure that no one ever finds out that she's illiterate and that she can't read. And once it's out and once they know, she can't really cope with that, and she has to lash out, and she has to, I think, destroy them. And she takes pleasure in that destruction. Yeah, I don't have all the answers about this film. I think it's masterfully created. I think it's certainly a masterpiece for Chabrol, for any director that would have put this together. The script is meticulous. Like I said, there's so many subtle issues about class in it, and about the interactions between John and Sophie and the family. There's so much there to talk about. There's so much there to unpack. I don't even think I've scratched the surface. I've just done my best to give you an idea of why I love this film and why I think it's like a masterpiece. And I'm not sure why more people don't talk about it. I do think Chabrol was a fan of Hitchcock, like a lot of the Cahiers du Cinema writers and directors were, along with Truffaut especially. And this had a Hitchcock feel in the sense that it was a thriller, but I love that it sort of took another sort of a deeper look at class, especially, and gender and violence. I think in the end it's also about violence, and I don't know if I've articulated it as well as I would have liked to, and put all the strands together. I mean, I may watch this film again in the future and see completely different things, but I'm just trying to share what I saw in it and what I found really compelling about these two women who form a deadly friendship and who are very much outsiders and pariahs. And yeah, I think I've said everything I can say about it. Yeah. But I do thank you for listening, and I hope this episode was helpful or interesting or whatever. I definitely hope so. I just really love this film, and I definitely would recommend it. And yeah, I watched it on Filmstruck, so that's where I found it. But anyways, I will stop here. Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, until next time, keep watching great movies. Bye for now.